Hey there, it's February 24th. Going to do a talk about what's been going on in the Bitcoin and Ethereum communities lately. I'm going to talk about a few quick things, little updates, and then I'm going to go into a major discussion that is developing within the communities. Okay, um, first of all, uh, just a little scam that's been going around is that it probably won't appear on my screen, but everybody's Twitter account, they're getting these little scam messages underneath it that say, send me Ether and I'll give you Ethereum back. But that's not really the Elon Musk Twitter account. So just be aware of that little scam that's happening with Vitalik and everybody who's very popular in Bitcoin at this time. And then to talk about some other topics that have been just going on briefly. There's been talk of governance in the communities and in the Ethereum community. They are talking about doing an ERP, and if you're familiar with that, it's Ethereum Recovery Protocol, which is basically a plan for hard forks. Now, the Bitcoin community, they're also talking about this. I'll get to that in a second. And this is some previous discussion going on about the ERP discussion. Nick Zaspo, he's kind of very relevant in the Bitcoin and Ethereum communities. He says to reduce the attack surfaces, the more kind of decisions there are to argue over, the less functional the institution will be, is his primary thesis or point. And then Philip Dion. I enjoy his government discussions. That's a picture of him there. I don't have a picture of Nick Sosbo there. Okay, and he says a dictatorship has zero attack surfaces, so isn't that the best form of governance? And my reply, in terms of what Nick Zaspo is attempting to say, this is my interpretation of what he's trying to say, um, is to add the word protocol governance versus people governance. So when we think about governance, we normally think about it in terms of mayors, states, and presidents. But in this situation, you want to think about it in terms of um, rules of the code. So when Nick Zaspo says um, the more kind of decisions there are to argue over, the less functional the institution will be, he's suggesting make some rules that are unbreakable. You could say like a constitution. And Ethereum has hard forks at a fairly regular basis, and it's planned to have hard forks, several of them, over the next year or two, maybe once a year, once every 6 months. And the way that you determine which is the true Ethereum is based on the one that effectively the Ethereum Foundation and Vitalik and the other developers of Ethereum, the one that they support, since if they are all in agreement, so the assumption is they're all going to be in agreement, then that is the true Ethereum. Now with Bitcoin, what Nick Zasbo is effectively trying to promote here is that there will never be a hard fork again, and thus there is no need to even discuss which is the true Bitcoin. Um, the true Bitcoin is the one that only has soft forks. The hard fork of Bitcoin can never be the true Bitcoin, as it's a break of rules. That's effectively what he means when he says the more kind of decisions there are to argue over. So if you start from the standpoint of never having a hard fork, then the only other way that you can go about changing code or protocol is to have a soft fork. And what a soft fork means is that someone can change the code on their end and it does not impact all those who choose not to support it, and you're still complying with the main chain. SegWit is a great example of a soft fork. Those who wanted to adopt SegWit were able to do so. Those who did not want to adopt SegWit did not get punished for it. But it did work better when those who did not want to adopt SegWit did not try to exclude SegWit transactions. So that's an example of a soft fork is SegWit. Increasing the block size would be an example of a hard fork, and BCH, Bcash or Vericash has a different system than Bitcoin, whereas those who are not on SegWit and those who have SegWit both use BTC. That is because it is a soft fork. So that's what I try to illustrate in this little comment here. Protocol governance is like how to lick ice cream, and the normal form of governance might be how to distribute ice cream, or the distribution of coins and money. And that's a very different form of governance that Nick is talking about, because Nick is asserting, let's not even consider the redistribution of coin as a possible solution to any sort of a problem. Philip talks about not looking behind the curtain there. Basically, that even if you agree to only have protocol changes, that there's still some form of governing going on behind that, and I agree with that. Victor Lee, I kind of like this opinion he had. He talks about even if there's no matter what type of blockchain governance there is, there's always going to be off-chain social consensus building. This could be a very libertarian mindset, which is to say that individual people, such as Vitalik and Vlad and Philip and Dean and so forth, and some other Ethereum people, Nick, Alex, Hudson, so on, Yoichi. These people, they already have one established form of association, which is the Ethereum Foundation and the GitHub that they all share in common and use. And Victor Lee is asserting that there's other types of off-chain social consensus building that can be used to govern a hard fork or a blockchain. And Philip is saying, let's define this process better. And I make a prediction that that Bitcoin will never hard fork again, which effectively means that minus bonus rewards are not up to discussion. Coin distribution is not up for discussion. Block size is not up for discussion. And so I'm asserting that in Nick's mind, all hard forks are not Bitcoin at this point in time. Philip and I go back and forth, and anyways, so that's a little bit of some precursor into the debate going on, and I'm going to say this briefly. This is called the trial of picks, and this is a good example of what I think Nick considers protocol versus people governance, which is some of the topic of this debate today.
Is randomly selected from production
to make sure that trial of the picks order are adhered to.
Okay, so the main thing I want to emphasize here is that while there is
so my name is Phil Hawkins.
While there is a governing body here, the range of decisions, and they have all these like court people, the range of actions and decisions that they're doing is just weighing coins and measuring coins. So this can be analogous to computers performing hash functions or nodes verifying honest transactions. So I think this is a good example of what Nick considers governance, whereas a lot of us might consider voting and coming to an agreement via a hierarchical system is a form of governance. Nick is asserting just Bitcoin continuing to work is sufficient form of governance. Okay, so 51% attack. Let's go into that. So I'm going to play a little bit of Andreas's 51% attack. Now, I'll also be covering the Bitcoin white paper here in a little bit, because this also talks about this issue quite a lot. And one thing I want to emphasize in the Bitcoin white paper is that they draw a lot of percentages about a 51% attack, and they don't even draw percentages for 51%. They assume that the most that a single entity could ever control is roughly 45%. With a 51% attack, it is actually quite a different scenario. And the main thing that I want to emphasize here is Andreas's simplification of the matter is very much overly simplified. As far as I'm concerned, I'll explain what I mean after we listen to his point.
Disrupt the blockchain.
Yeah, I don't worry about that at all. This cannot be done with Bitcoin anymore. This is something that can only be done with nascent altcoins. Bitcoin has achieved a level of computing that no single nation state can overthrow it through computation alone. The effort to do so would require a massive covert operation of chip fabrication, then the coordinated assault that would give them dominance over the next block for 10 minutes until we kick those bastards off the network, rework the protocol around them. They would be revealed. They would have lost $1 billion doing this, and all they got to do was one double spend. Now,
okay, just to pick apart the technicals of what Andreas asserted just then, is that there would be that we'd realize the double spend within one block's worth of time, which equates to 10 to 20 minutes, whatever. And Andreas asserts that it would cost $1 billion, and he assumes, for talking purposes, that the 51% attacker has no pre-investment in hardware, so he introduces it with the assumption that the 51% attacker needs to first acquire hardware. However, realistically, they would acquire hardware first before they do the 51% attack, granted.
Here's the thing. Long before we get to that point, they figure out that if they just let this stuff run, they can actually get some Bitcoin as a reward, because the incentive structure actually works.
Okay, so there's no real more added information. He just kind of goes on about how getting Bitcoin honestly is better than stealing Bitcoin. So I'm going to go into the white paper briefly now. So I'm going to, let's see if I can make this screen capital set, the full thing. Okay, whatever, good enough. Okay, so let's see if this works. So I'm going to go into the white paper just briefly for the Bitcoin white paper, and I'll show you how to read it regarding these computations here, and I'll also read some of the more interesting aspects of the white paper regarding the concepts of governance and attacks. So you can kind of jump to the conclusion here in the white paper if you want to see where Bitcoin talks about these ideas and the concept of a 51% attack. I highlighted a few little portions that I'll kind of read to help summarize it here. Not sure how well that's really viewable on screen, but that's fine, doesn't really matter. This section sort of does matter. So I kind of summarized how to read it. Q is reference to percent of hash power, so if Q was 1, then somebody would have 100% of hash power. Q as 0.3, 30% of hash power. Z equals number of blocks. So you can think of a block as occurring in 10 minutes, so 5Z is 50 minutes of time. And then 99% of accuracy. So if you want greater than 99% accuracy and someone is trying to fabricate with 30% of hash power, then it takes roughly 3 hours to achieve 99% accuracy. So that's what's the purpose of reviewing these calculations that are presented in the white paper? Well, the purpose, one, hopefully I understand it correct, so you can verify this yourself to see if I'm explaining it well. But also, it's important to see what is the true concern of the 51% attack in terms of probabilities. Now, I have not done it here. Hopefully someone will do it in comments or in discussion. But let's talk about what they present here. So in the white paper, with 30% attack, in order to get greater than 1 in 8 or 7 in 8 chance of discovering the double spend, it takes approximately an hour. So that's the main emphasis there. For 7 out of 8 to be correct, it takes roughly 1 hour if the person only has 30% of the hash power. It goes on to say that if you want a probability of 99.9% accuracy, so 999 out of 1,000 are accurate, if someone has 45% of the hash power, it would take approximately, I don't even have it here, but approximately 2 days. So with 45% of hash power, to achieve 99.9% accuracy, which is what the white paper references as a tool or a guide, it takes approximately 3 days to achieve that level of accuracy. However, socially, we can say that maybe 7 out of 8 is a very reasonable level of accuracy, and with 30% of hash power, that takes 1 hour. And if someone has 50% of hash power, I did not calculate this like I mentioned, but it goes up from, for 10% of hash power, it takes 1 block. For 30% of hash power, it takes about 6 blocks to get that level of accuracy. And so you can see the level of escalation there. And I think once you get to, and then, well anyways, for 50% of hash power, I think you're going to be looking at the magnitude of 3 to 4 hours to get a 7 out of 8 accuracy if someone is trying to disrupt Bitcoin with 50% of hash power. So let's think about that. So you have costs and income that occur over 365 days. If Bitcoin is disrupted and no one knows if their Bitcoin transaction is going to go through or not, and it takes 7 hours to discover, or 3 hours, whatever. It takes approximately 3 hours to discover which is the true Bitcoin, and then you have to create a fork chain, and then you have to exclude that person's key. So we'll go over this a bit in terms of the options that they have when it comes to disruption. But you have to exclude this person's key, and maybe you take away all the money they have. But if they're smart and they make a new key before they create the disruption in the blockchain, and you can't figure out which keys that they're using because they're moving transactions prior to committing the fraud, then you might have a difficulty in trying to exclude their account balance from future versions of Bitcoin. So if you assume that you're able to locate the originating account of the disturbance and exclude it in your new fork, then great, they only get you to do it once, and if they have all their eggs in one basket and you can exclude it one time, then you did it all in one fell swoop. And it took a course of 3 hours of shutting down Bitcoin for reliable transacting, but it's done with, and it's a one-time issue. But if they have their accounts spread over thousands of accounts, or their money, if they are able to create 2 layers of a double spend, if they're able to create the first spend and then the second spend, so it might become more difficult to find which was the originating transaction. If you're not able to create the fork within the 3 hours and you have to wait 6 hours in order to create the fork, then Bitcoin's down for 6 hours. How do you know that you'll be ready when the double spend occurs? Because they don't announce it. They're not going to tell you we're about to take over the Bitcoin at this time. All you know is that with a 50% rate of hash power or greater, their probability of getting a double spend, the amount of time it takes for 7 out of 8 nodes to know that there's a false transaction is approximately, I am going to guess 3 hours, but we can wait to get some more math on that. But it's going to take quite a while before you know that before you're positive that there's a new, that there's a false double spend. Okay. So before we go back to the computer screen, let me do some referencing in the white paper of what it talks about these issues. And I'll first primarily read the white paper showing some graphs that are relevant, just to go over it because it's a fun little thing. So this is the diagram of Bitcoin, and so just to point to what happens here. First, you have an account. You send coin to public address 2, and then your account plus your private key create a signature. This confirms that the coin will go to address 2, creating the transaction, and then the transaction gets pushed along the blockchain. So I kind of made little notes here. Transaction plus, so sending Bitcoin, but transaction sending Bitcoin plus next public key equal hash. Public key plus private key equals signature. Okay. So it says regarding transactions, the fate of the entire money system depends on the company running the mint. So this is in reference to gold. When you depend on a mint for verification, then the mint becomes the most important thing in time in town. Okay, then regarding section 3 of the white paper, timestamp server. Each timestamp includes the previous timestamp in its hash, forming a chain with each additional timestamp reinforcing the one before it. This just references how do you know which block came first. You use timestamps using, I think it's consensus timestamping, where you take the average time of all the nodes run. And then the blocks don't need to come in exact order, but so long as, since Bitcoin is reset every 2 weeks or 216 blocks, it takes the average time over that 2-week period. So sometimes some blocks might have out of order timestamp, but it doesn't affect the resetting of the difficulty terribly much. So section 4 regarding proof of work, Bitcoin uses atom backs hash. And just to go over that, if the majority were based, so if you used IP addresses, which is like a master noding type of system, or you don't have to use master noding, but it's a round robin way of awarding block reward or block bonuses. So with an IP system, if you take the assumption that every house has an IP address and one IP address per house, then you can randomly give the Bitcoin bonus reward to each IP address. But if that's not true, which it's not true, just so you know, then one person can acquire thousands of IP addresses, and they will randomly get 1,000 times more than everybody else. However, the ability to acquire an excessive number of IP addresses other than America is actually quite difficult, as far as I know. Yes, China can combine all the IP addresses that they're allocated into one giant IP address, I guess. I don't know. But they are kind of fairly well distributed around the continent. America has a much smaller population relative to the number of IP addresses that they were awarded. So in America, you can get one IP address per person, but in China, you definitely cannot. And so the main thing I want to emphasize there is America or China does not have 51% of all IP addresses. So while IP addresses are not perfectly distributed by any means, it is not that one nation over another has more than 51% of IP addresses. Okay, so if the majority were based on one IP address, one vote, it could be subverted by anyone able to allocate many IP addresses. One proof of work is essentially one computer, one vote. If a majority of computing power is controlled by honest nodes, the honest chain will grow the fastest and outpace any competing chains. Difficulty is determined by a moving average targeting an average number of blocks per hour. If they are generated too fast, the difficulty increases. So the difficulty is changed every 2 weeks or 216 blocks. And it mentions here honest nodes. So honest nodes, in Bitcoin, they mean uncoordinated nodes. When you refer to honest nodes, it's referring to uncoordinated nodes. So at the current time in Bitcoin, over 51% of the nodes are coordinated nodes. So we can assume that they are mining power, I should say. Nodes and mining power are different. But the nodes are more uncoordinated than coordinated. So the nodes are honest. And so this goes into, now it says if the majority were, so it says one CPU, one vote. Proof of work is essentially one CPU, one vote. Now this statement is completely not true today. This is a completely false statement in today's world. Proof of work is essentially one CPU, one vote. So this is an ideal behind Bitcoin that is not factually correct, or it did not manifest in the functioning of Bitcoin. Proof of work is not one CPU, one vote at all. Nodes are one CPU, one vote, roughly, because noding is fairly well distributed. There's no one who has more than 50% of the nodes as far as I know. But proof of work, if you have ASICs, which they do in China, then you have over 50% of the vote. So that's an ideal that did not manifest in reality. Moving on to section 5 of the Bitcoin white paper. It talks about if you have a dispute, you save the other branch, and in case it becomes longer, the tie will be broken when the next proof of work is found and one branch becomes longer. So if there's a tie, you keep both until you see which one gets more blocks faster, which is another way of saying which one has more hash power. So if one has 51% of the hash power, then they can make their false chain longer for a sustained period of time and make it appear to be the valid one if there's a dispute between the blocks. However, you do know when the false chain occurs. So I'll go over it briefly here, but when you are creating a false chain, you only get exposed to the nature of the false chain after X amount of time. So as mentioned before, if you have roughly 50% of the hash power, it might take 3 hours to get the exposure of the false chain. So if the deal is concluded within 3 hours, if I send Bitcoin to Amazon and then 3 hours later my chain gets exposed that my payment to Amazon got rejected, it got accepted at first, and then 3 hours later it got rejected, and Amazon has already shipped the product that it meant to give me, and I now have possession of the Amazon product, and Amazon they have no basis for getting a refund on what they did. So if I use like local Bitcoins or Coinbase or something, so if they have no ability to get a refund because I've already received the product, then I've won in this scenario. So you do kind of have some idea of who's committing the forgery based on who received the goods, but maybe you're a trickster with that, and you do a lot of false chains just to create confusion in the marketplace. You don't have to benefit yourself from the double spend. You can try to benefit an anonymous party to paint them as in bad light. You could do a variety of things just to create disruption in the network. Okay, regarding incentives, constant amount of new coins is analogous to gold miners expending resources to add gold to circulation. In our case, it is CPU time and electricity that is expended. So gold miners, in order to get more gold, they share the gold with the world, buy equipment, which helps them mine more gold. So this is a way to get gold distributed to the system so that gold miners don't hoard all gold that they discover. If a greedy attacker is able to assemble more CPU power than all honest nodes, he would have to choose between using it to defraud people by stealing back his payments or using it to generate new coins. He ought to find it more profitable to play by the rules, such rules that favor him with more new coins than everybody else combined, than to undermine the system and the validity of his own wealth. So, to talk about this briefly, this is talking about what are the options. He can defraud people by stealing back his payments. So this is the main system of fraud that he can commit, stealing back his payments, or use it to generate new coins, or using it to generate new coins. I'm not quite positive what he's talking about there, but maybe somebody creates 4 or 5 blocks back to back to back, and they create a lead time and they can discover new Bitcoins in a very quick rate. You might have noticed that, well, I noticed anyway, and some others in the Bitcoin community noticed that there's a point over the last month or two where 6 or 7 blocks were discovered within 10 minutes. So it's supposed to be 6 blocks over the course of an hour, but there is a period where 6 blocks were discovered over the course of 10 minutes. So what could happen is that someone can discover these blocks ahead of time. They can wait 8 minutes and then release their secret block that they have stored up, and effectively have people set an hour behind in terms of trying to discover the next block. And if they can stay ahead perpetually, if they can perpetually stay ahead, then there's no ability for anyone else who's mining to ever earn reward on their chain, because they have these secret blocks stored up, which is the cumulative mining reward. And since they know that the mining reward is supposed to be released every 10 minutes, they can space their blocks to every 8 minutes. And since it won't be reset for another 2 weeks, they can do this for quite a while to earn 2 weeks of all the new Bitcoin reward, which is quite a significant amount of money at this point in time. Let's go ahead and get a rough calculation of what is 2 weeks of all the Bitcoin reward. It's approximately $250,000. Wait, not $250,000, $250 million. So 250 million. Yeah, I think that's right. I'm gonna check that one more time. Yeah, about $250 million is distributed over the Bitcoin network every 2 weeks. So you can claim that all yourself if you have over 50% of the hash power. Okay. So then it talks about section 7, reclaiming disk space. The interior hashes do not need to be stored. With computer systems typically selling 2 gigabytes of RAM as of 2008. So that's just a little time reference to let you know how much computers have changed. Computers sell for much more than 2 gigabytes of RAM on average, maybe 100 gigabytes of RAM, I think. It's pretty normal. Storage space, I should say. It says RAM. Yeah, okay. Well, it hasn't increased by that much. That's right. And it also talks about the Merkle roots, which I'm going to say here. So the Merkle root, a good way to think about it is the buddy system. Verify the whole by counting by 2s is what I say here. So so it talks about hash combining. I won't really go over that, but basically you can think of this as Brangela. So first you have Brad Pitt, Angelina Jolie. They combine and they create a hash called Brangela, and then you might have Brangela and Ben Affleck and J-Lo. I don't know what they were called, but let's call them Joe Ben. So Joe Ben and Brangela combine, and they create like Brangigo Bolin. Anyways, so that's the hashing thing. That's the Merkle tree. And the reason that that's important is it allows you to limit the amount of information you need from the other side of the transactions. Once you and a buddy confirm yourselves and you push it along and you create Brangela, then you both are working toward the same goal now, versus if you have all the transactions into one giant thing, and if there's 10 transactions together and then one more comes into the picture and then another one and then another one, you have to start over based on each transaction that comes through. But if you do the Merkle tree route and you pair up as you go along, then as soon as you get a pair, then you know you're good to go and you're going to get created. You'll be included in the new block, basically. Okay, section 8. A user only needs to keep a copy of the block headers. So this is talking about light nodes. So light nodes just use the block headers. The simplified method can be fooled by an attacker fabricating transactions for as long as the attacker continued to overpower the network. So yeah, it just talks about attacks again. Section 9, combining and splitting value. One for the payment and one returning to the change. If any, back to sender. there is never need to extract a complete standalone copy of transaction history. So yeah, that's just more about talking Merkle trees, more or less. Okay, privacy. Privacy can be kept by keeping one's public keys anonymous. A new key pair should be used for each transaction to keep them from being linked to a common sender. So just to talk about the privacy that it does in Bitcoin, it says that one, you're never supposed to link or reveal your private key to an individual, so it suggests doing that. And then also it says, it suggests, so if you have 10 Bitcoins in your wallet and you're sending 1 Bitcoin out to somebody, maybe you send all 10, 1 goes to the new person, 9 goes to a new Bitcoin address that you then control as well. So you're changing your Bitcoin address every time, and you're effectively just moving all of your Bitcoins with every transaction. And then it goes into the calculations that I kind of opened with, but I'll just read about this some. An attacker can only try to change one of his own transactions to take back the money he recently spent. So yeah, it's talking about the limit of what the attacker can do. He can only try to change his own transactions to take back the money he recently spent, or get a head start on all the new block reward of a Bitcoin, which over a 2-week period can be valued at $250 million or $250 million. It's quite a lot of money. Okay, so double spending is less advantageous as seizing all block reward. That would be more advantageous at this time, assuming no one can pull a double spend of a $250 million. Okay. If he doesn't make a lucky lunge forward early on, his chances become vanishingly small as he falls further behind. The receiver will be alerted when that happens, but the sender hopes it to be too late. The sender guarantees a new key pair and gives the public key to the sender shortly before signing. Once the transaction is sent, the dishonest sender starts working in secret on the parallel chain, containing an alternative version of the transaction history. And then it goes into all the little calculations I kind of introduced with. In conclusion, quickly becomes computationally impractical for an attacker to change if honest nodes control a majority of CPU power. So, this is not true today. Honest nodes, or the nodes, do not control a majority of CPU power. Nodes probably control roughly 20% of CPU power, maybe less. And the vast majority of CPU power is concentrated really in China with Bitmain, and they control well over 50% of the CPU power. So the assumptions in the Bitcoin white paper are completely false in today's world. And just to finish up with the white paper and cover references, I'm just going to do them in the order of which they were discovered in time. Probability theory in 1957 by Feller is referenced. Public protocols of public key cryptic systems in 1980 by Merkle, the Merkle tree. That's in 1980. And then we got timestamp of digital documents by Haber. We got digital timestamping by Haber again. We got bit strings by Haber as well. We got timestamping service by an assortment of authors. So this is all about timestamping. And before that we had B-Money by WDAI. So I haven't looked into B-Money. I want to look into that sometime. I think that's interesting. And then we got Adam Back's Hashcash in 2002 being the most recent discovery. The Bitcoin white paper 2008, I believe, and the Bitcoin beginning in 2009. So about 6 years before that, you had Adam Back's Hashcash paper, which Bitcoin used. Okay, and that's the most recent of the discoveries. Okay, so that covers the Bitcoin white paper. Now let's go on and see what the world is talking about here. Did I do that right? Nope, I did not. Give me just a second. Okay. All right. So let's go through here and kind of see what we're talking about, and what the community is talking about. Cobra is the owner of Bitcoin.org, and Cobra has released 3 papers as of late on Medium. One in November, one in December, one in February. So what Cobra says, in November there will be 3 blockchains. Have your popcorn ready. The evil 2x corporate takeover, so he's not a fan of the bigger blocks, if you're familiar with the big block thing going on. He talks about a black swan or Bitcoin tanking, and basically the people who supported the small blocks not winning. That's not what ended up happening, but there you go. And then he talks about a variety of other things. I can't really find it all in here, but he takes a very strong stance that mining centralization is bad. It is against the Bitcoin white paper largely, but he takes a strong stance that mining centralization is bad. And then I am going to read his open paper mostly in full because it's quite interesting. It's not terribly long, but it also has some strong language that I don't want to take out of context too much. So Cobra, an open letter to the Bitcoin community to change the proof of work algorithm. One of the reasons many of you got into Bitcoin was the fact that it's decentralized. But did you know that that is slowly changing? More and more of the network hash rate is starting to become concentrated into the hands of one man and his company. The security of our network essentially depends on them acting honorably and us being prepared to respond to it. They get more powerful each day. Based on conservative estimates of gross margin of 75% and operating margin of 65%, Bernstein analysts calculate that Beijing-based Bitmain, run by Jihan Wu, made $3 billion to $4 billion in operating profits in 2017. And I'll just let you know, for those who are unfamiliar with Bitmain, they're currently looking for real estate all across the world to effectively purchase all the cheap electricity across the world, because it's so profitable to them. They're expanding quite rapidly, because this is quite an insane amount of profit for a company that's only a few years old. As long as they control the majority of the hash rate, the only way to keep the network secure is the threat of a hard fork to a new proof of work, but this will only work as long as the community is reasonably small and still overwhelmingly shares the same morals of decentralized Bitcoin. In a decentralized system, we shouldn't put up with a position where we rely on a centralized point of failure to behave themselves. People talk about new entrants to the mining scene, but it's almost impossible for anyone to catch up to the total domination of the mining space by Bitmain. They are light years ahead. That $4 billion of profit that will be used to build even better hardware, allowing them to further dominate mining for the foreseeable future and likely buy stakes in their competitors. The hash rate has already been abused to give political support to reckless and dangerous hard fork attempts. They have questionable allegiance to Bitcoin at best, seeming more interested in supporting Bcash, undermining the very network that employs them. Even more dangerously, they are based in China, a country with a long track of human rights abuses, censorship, and generally evil behavior. The miners are in a position where the Chinese government can take control of their equipment at any time. Sometime they will no doubt do something that they will no doubt do if Bitcoin grows enough to people to allow them to use the control of the hash rate to push a Chinese geopolitical agenda. The more Bitcoin grows, the harder it becomes to hard fork. If it's this bad right now, it could be even worse in a few years' time. But by then it will be too late. We don't want our transactions being decided by the Chinese government. The solution is to adopt a new hybrid proof of work system, possibly with a combination of POS combination and choosing algorithms that are very easy and simple to build ASICs for. The playing field needs to be even again and structured in a way where it's harder for one entity to dominate. The truth in that proof of work provides very little security if it's distributed effectively. If it's distributed effectively among multiple independent participants. This is historically why mining pools were very careful to avoid accumulating too much hash rate. But now we have a situation where one man controls the majority of hash rate. And we are okay with that so long as he behaves himself. Imagine if someone followed you around with a gun pressed against your head and you were okay with this because he incentivized to not shoot me because of the threat of jail. People would call you stupid and crazy, yet when it comes to Bitcoin, we're totally fine with thinking along those lines. Economic incentives only work when broadly applied to many participants. If the mining was distributed among 100 independent miners, each with 1% hash rate spread all over the world, you can trust economic incentives to work as expected. It's much less likely for something to happen that would take control of 51 of these miners. However, if you have 3 miners who control matter who matter with 2/3 of them in one country, these incentives break down. Maybe their government takes their equipment, or they are insane, or they are just evil. This mining problem is the root cause of all Bitcoin's problems. It's the miners that have supported every hostile attempt to take over the network. It's the miners who block new features for their strange political agenda. It's the miners who lend support to altcoins that undermine Bitcoin. We need to get rid of them while we still can. They're no longer a useful part of the community. Hard forks are scary, but let's not be afraid to at least try to build consensus when we can all see the problem right in front of us. This is Cobra, co-owner of Bitcoin.org and BitcoinTalk.org. So, um, the community has not had a terribly positive response. I won't go into that too much. But anyways, it's a very scary subject to the community, the idea of having a hard fork. But I wanted to read what Cobra had to say, and also the main emphasis that is being wrongly portrayed very, very often in the community is that he proposes a solution not of changing the proof of work system to one that is impossible to build ASICs for, but to change to a proof of work system that is very easy and simple to build ASICs for. And we can clarify what he means here, but he means it's very easy and simple to build ASICs for, and it becomes a open source building algorithm, and there's no source that controls maybe a large supply of the raw material needed to build an ASIC for this system. So when it becomes to distributing or controlling Bitcoin, it's very difficult. But when it comes to acquiring all the mineral rights of a precious material required to build ASICs, China has quite a good, maybe monopoly is not the right word, but quite a good percent of the new material available because they have different mining standards. And also, in terms of manufacturing these products, Jihan Wu, he controls some of the best manufacturers and scientists of this category in the world. So he does have something of a monopoly in that category. And it seems like Cobra is proposing creating an open source ASIC manufacturing system and changing to a proof of work and possibly proof of stake combination that is reliant upon this easy and simple ASIC system that is open source. Bitcoin Gold had a similar type of concept, and they wanted to use GPU mining versus the standard Bitcoin mining. Now, the difference between Bitcoin Gold and what Cobra is proposing is that in Cobra's model, you would have to create the open source ASIC first and then switch to that, where you got the patents confirmed to be open source. Whereas if you switch and then attempt to defeat Jihan Wu in creating the open source mining algorithm before he can patent the technology, you will be guaranteed to lose. Okay, here's Cobra's post about it. Here's Jihan Wu, the man who acquired $4 billion last year, so quite a good capitalist. And here's Cobra, he's just an image. Okay, Jihan Wu says, which job is your priority, to rewrite the white paper or change the proof of work? White paper will never be rewritten, but proof of work will definitely be changed. That is cool. When you achieved it, Bitcoin's market share in the cryptocurrency will fall under 10%. Good luck. So this is the lead miner of Bitcoin, the one who acquires more than 51% of all Bitcoins currently. He's in corporation. He says that if you attempt to kick me out, Bitcoin's market share will fall to under 10%. It's currently around 40%. So he's suggesting that Bitcoin's price will fall from $10,000 to $2,500, basically less than Bcash, which is another coin that he supported quite a bit, and that's referenced in Cobra's attack by the miners. Glad you acknowledge it's a matter of when, not if, regarding the market share. I'm sure the market will love a more decentralized Bitcoin. That might be a little bit questionable. Jihan Wu controls already probably 10% of all Bitcoin. So if he was to sell $10 billion worth of Bitcoin and we were to have to purchase it, or if we were to increase the Bitcoin price while he owns maybe 10% of all the Bitcoins, then he gets all that profit, and his $10 billion sell order can become a $20 billion sell order if the price of Bitcoin doubled. So it is very difficult to actually hurt someone unless you were to take over their Bitcoin account if you knew which was his Bitcoin account. Okay. And he says, "Why are you playing these political games?" and he says, "Ethereum's great. Why don't you do what Ethereum is doing?" So anyways, so this is the stuff that's going on, and people of I would say naturally are kind of against this idea. People are against change. Chris Wright, who claims to be Satoshi, and he tells everyone he is Satoshi. He says Bcash is the best, basically. So it's just kind of funny. So, but Jihan Wu is a very big player. I didn't really click on his. Here, let me go ahead and click on his profile just so you can see the confirm if you're unfamiliar with who Jihan Wu is. Co-founder of Bitmain, Beijing, China. Okay, so that's Jihan Wu. So that's good there. And then to go back to Cobra's profile, let's just see what Cobra has been up to. He's been making a lot of posts today. Some of his follow-up posts have been what is Bitcoin? So Bitcoin.org is the main Bitcoin website. Bitcoin.com supports Bcash or Vericash. And Bitcoin.org supports BTC or Bitcoin, and Cobra is a co-owner of Bitcoin.org. Jihan Wu, he owns BTC.com, and so and also 50% of all new Bitcoins get awarded to Jihan Wu, and also it's speculated, but it's effectively confirmed. Jihan Wu sent a lot of minor Bitcoin transactions through the blockchain in order to get the transaction fees up really high. Since he had 50% of the hash rate, he got 50% of the transaction fees. So sending these little false transaction fees, increasing the transaction fee for everyone, created more money than he lost through sharing his transaction fee with some of the people who were able to get the transaction fee rewards. So Jihan Wu was behind that, and he also is behind disrupting the Bitcoin hash power mechanism. As mentioned before, it updates every 2 weeks, and so what Jihan Wu was able to do is he was able to get it to where he set Bitcoin Cash to have their algorithm change every 2 weeks, and he would flood Bitcoin with hash power, and the blocks would be generated on an average every 8 minutes, and then he would pull all of his hash power away at once. And so for the next 2 weeks, blocks would be generated on an average of 12 minutes. So this creates a backlog in transactions because 8-minute blocks process transactions faster than 12-minute blocks. And then also it creates disruptive mining profits because when you're getting block reward, which is 250 million roughly every 2 weeks right now, when you get that, when that goes down from 400 million to 200 million, then the hash rate of that you're able to support on the blockchain changes dramatically. Now, for those who are unfamiliar with how the transaction fee has been changing for Bitcoin, we are now to a rate where 1 Satoshi per byte will get a Bitcoin transaction through over the course of a day or two. And for the last week or so, the Bitcoin block reward, transaction fee has been down to 1 Satoshi. And for those who are curious as to what percent change that is, if we look back over the course of 3 months and we go to Christmas time, the amount that people were having to pay was 1,000 Satoshis. And over the last week or so, they've been paying 1 Satoshi, which is this blue number down here. And 1 Satoshi is effectively the minimum transaction fee. So it was 1,000 times more to send Bitcoin during Christmas. This was partly the work of Jihan Wu's Bcash attack, partly. Now, with SegWit adopted on SegWit and batching of transactions on Coinbase, it is very likely that we will stay at 1 Satoshi per transaction fee confirmation within 24 hours for the next foreseeable future. However, if you own 10 Bitcoins, then you own a billion Satoshis. So Jihan Wu can send 1 billion transactions back and forth at the cost of 1 Satoshi, at the cost of 10 Bitcoins. He can send a billion transactions back and forth just to try to tie up the network, even though he would lose 10 Bitcoins worth of value. He's competing for $250 million every 2 weeks. And in terms of Bitcoin, that's 25,000 Bitcoins every 2 weeks. So he has quite a few Bitcoins to spend. And since a transaction costs 1 Satoshi, if he wanted to just attack a new network, he could flood it with miner transactions for quite a while, just to annoy and mess people's lives up. Okay, so Cobra again references China being a big threat, and so that's about all I wanted to show there. And here's some public discussion of it. Miners are not evil, is what this person says. Changing the mining algorithm can help. So the main argument that they say is that there's a competition. So if you change the to another thing that doesn't use ASIC, then the centralized miners will still acquire that one as well. And then you'll just be left with the same problem. But what Cobra argues is that you create an open source ASIC mining platform that is the fastest in the world, and you patent it as open source, and no private person can build a patent on top of it and block other people from creating that that type of hardware. So a lot of people either choose to ignore that or they miss out on that. I am not sure. Okay, and this was introduced. Cobra, miners are evil. We need to get rid of them. Open letter to the Bitcoin community. So this is a very biased comment by Crypto Nicholas. He did not say miners are evil. He said the centralized control of mining is evil, which is referenced very quite frequently in the Bitcoin white paper. That it doesn't even run through a scenario where someone really controls 51%. All the scenarios that it proposes, someone has up to 30% of hash power, and then in a very, very, very comical world, someone has 45% of hash power, and the issues are resolved after 48 hours. So that's a very strange situation to assume that this is a happy amount of time to figure out which is true and which one is the false Bitcoin after 2 days worth of trial. And again, with if Jihan Wu is competing for block reward, then and let's just say he has 3 months of block reward built up that he's willing to spend in order to destroy a competing chain, he could repeat this loss cycle over the course of 3 months, or periodically whenever he feels like the time is right, whenever the conditions are perfect geopolitically and socially. Reddit censorship, perhaps Twitter censorship, perhaps the sudden change in leadership, whatever. So he gets to strike at his leisure. So a lot of these assumptions that are kind of presented in the white paper regarding the possibility of attack do not even take into account a Jihan Wu style of attack. They assume that no one ever controls more than basically 30% of the hash power, whereas Jihan Wu has 50%. Okay. Andre Annapolis says what he says, and everybody's just outstanding dude. Andreas for president. I've never seen him kill it like this. I will play again what he says, just so that you can kind of think about what he says a little bit more, considering the reality versus the way that he describes it, if he's describing reality accurately. So David Harding, he goes on to attack Cobra. Again, you see Cobra getting attacked over and over again in social media. He references that Cobra has 43 commits, whereas many other people have a lot more commits than Cobra does. So this is reference to GitHub, and this is reference to how much work he's putting in. So he's saying that Cobra is not doing his share of work, and Cobra says, I devoted countless hours. Not everything is a measure of commits. It's telling that you resort to personal attacks rather than debating ideas. So I agree with Cobra here. Not every commits. If you're making minor commits and you push them through on a regular basis, like basically like proofreading a paper or a fact page, or translating from English to Chinese, or translating something from Windows to Linux, then maybe those sorts of commits create a lot of authorship and can really bump up your numbers. Whereas creating the original code, like for example the Bitcoin white paper, writing the original Bitcoin white paper and providing the original Bitcoin code, even though it's technically only one commit or two commits, it's a lot of value, and everything else is built on top of that. So whoever creates the original commits, those are more valued than the people who create the copies or the translations, as it's referenced. Okay, so it's not really talked about at Bitcoin very much. So I'm going to replay what Andrea says. So the question is reference to 51% attack, and the main thing that I want to emphasize in terms of what he says, which I believe to be quite falsely portraying the concept of the attack. He asserts that it would be discovered within one block. I think a more accurate statement is 3 hours.
Nation state that has interest in just actively destroying Bitcoin to make their own, super rigs and design chips and just throw hundreds of millions or billions of dollars to intentionally disrupt the blockchain.
Yeah, I don't worry about that at all. This cannot be done with Bitcoin anymore. This is something that can only be done with nascent altcoins. Bitcoin has achieved a level of computing that no single nation state can overthrow it through computation alone. The effort to do so would require a massive covert operation of chip fabrication, then the coordinated assault that would give them dominance over the next block for 10 minutes until we kick those bastards off the network, rework the protocol around them. They would be revealed. They would have lost $1 billion doing this, and all they got to do was one double spend. Now, here's the thing. Long before we get to that point, they figure out that if they just let this stuff run, they can actually get some Bitcoin as a reward, because the incentive structure actually works. And so I'm not worried about that. And a lot of people are watching the blockchain. And as I said before, what are they going to do? So they take over and they fork the blockchain and they go somewhere, right? They've created an alternative blockchain. Great. What are we going to do? Who's going to join the NSA blockchain? Anybody want to jump on FedCoin? So we're all going to stay on the old fork. Difficulty will go down. It will get more profitable for the miners who stayed behind, and we'll carry on with our coin, and they can go mine whatever the hell they want on their alternative blockchain. They achieve nothing. They can't make protocol changes because, as I said, 5 constituencies in consensus, and it would take $1 billion to pull the most ridiculous Keystone Cops failure in history. Plus, this would actually require government that can do IT.
Okay, now I know Andreas is talking to the general public here, but just some things that he kind of said that I might consider out of context. He says that it would be discovered in 1 block. Well, if you have a 51% attack, you're talking more like 3 hours most likely for it to be figured out conclusively. And then he talks about a double spend when also securing all future block reward for this period of 2 weeks. Are $250 million might be the what you get out of it as opposed to a single double spend. And then also he talks about a federal nation state who doesn't know how to do IT. Well, if you assume that they already have the miners, which is what you should have, which is what you should assume. If you assume Jihan Wu might be one of these people, then he already has all this stuff. So that's he's way ahead of you there, and he already has 51% attack, 51% of the hash power. So it's not like he has to create this all new stuff. It's already in existence. So anyway, so I'll let you review those ideas. Do you think that Cobra's concerns are more accurate to the Bitcoin white paper? Do you think Andreas portrayed the argument very well right there in terms of the risks and rewards that are being discussed? And do you think Nick's system of just no more hard forking of Bitcoin, unless it, because that's a hard fork to the protocol, limit the variety of tax vectors, attack sources? Do you think Nick's system of governance is more accurate? Do you think Philippe Diane, do you feel his discussions of governance regarding that even if you are discussing protocol changes that you need to have some kind of hierarchical system, either Republican, Democrat, some kind of round robin voting, some kind of system or structure beyond the libertarian, I know him, he knows her, we are long-term friends of Bitcoin, we can all trust one another, which is more the system that Nick kind of has proposed in the past. So anyways, what are your thoughts there? What are your systems of governance determining the true Bitcoin is being decentralized in terms of the distribution of future Bitcoin or mining power? A critical aspect of the white paper is the possibility of attack. What would you do if there was a hard fork of Bitcoin and someone acquired more hash power than Bitcoin and the Bitcoin price of the hard fork was falling as some miners were creating sell-offs? So to try to create a coin which they control the majority of. One example of this being Vericash or Bitcoin Cash, which is controlled majority by miners, even more so than Bitcoin is by a long shot. And then Bitcoin Gold was an attempt to take away miner control, but as its ASIC was not open source, it also has the possibility of being acquired by miners developing ASICs specifically for Bitcoin Gold. So Cobra's plan of creating open source ASIC has not been tried yet, and we can see how it turns out in the future, but it's going to be an interesting discussion over the next few weeks. I hope this has been informative, and if it's the first time getting introduced to the Bitcoin white paper, I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you. Bye.